Welcome to Poland Daily History with me, Nicholas Richardson. Today we're looking at the subject of Polish-Jewish relations, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by my guest Matthew Tyrmand, who is a columnist, a strategic analyst, but also in the context of today's discussion is the son of Leo Tyrmand, a novelist. Matthew, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, can we look at, we were talking earlier about the importation of sort of division where division need not exist. And I think this became very clear, didn't it, when we get to the Second World War. I remember in interviewing or chatting to earlier Julian Kulski, who survived a Warsaw Uprising, survivor now, lives in America. And he said that before the war, people were just Polish. It didn't matter whether you're Protestant, Catholic, Jewish or whatever. And that it was when the Germans arrived that all of a sudden this division was driven into society, and obviously quite dramatically. So would you agree that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, my father was living proof of that, given sort of his secular bourgeois life and sort of upper middle class Warsaw from merchant class family. I mean, even though his grandfather, my great grandfather, was rabbi at the Nożyk synagogue, he was highly secularized and highly urban and urbane. He grew up speaking not just Polish but French. And in fact, during the war, which I know we'll talk about, he passed himself off as a Frenchman because his French was so good. He studied at l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in '39 when the war broke out. So, I mean, he was certainly part of the society that was highly integrated into this between the war Poland that was thriving until Hitler's invasion and the decision to execute both the final solution as well as dominion over Poland and all of Central Europe as their starting point.
I mean, for us looking back, it's just hard to imagine, isn't it, that fighting a war is one thing, but actually picking a section of the population to say, well, we want to exterminate you, which is essentially what happened. Well,
I leave that to Hannah Arendt to break down in the German zeitgeist.
Yes, and of course then in Warsaw, there was a physical division with the establishment of the ghetto and then building a wall around this area where Jews had to live, expelling the Polish population, bringing in far too many people and sort of imprisoning them. Yeah. I mean, in terms of that, must itself have created great tension within the city, and people suddenly finding their neighbour who happened to be Jewish or not Jewish was somehow divided from them physically.
Well, a lot of the most heroic stories I think you see from this period, where especially in cities like Warsaw, where the integration was so strong and so coterminous, where Poles and Jews were part of the same society. I think it was a little bit different when you're in the smaller towns that were side by side with the shtetls, where it was more of a lower class and a peasant class, where there was less education and a little bit more vitriol just naturally as sort of the course of order, which we still see today in society, among the classes. But in terms of, the ghettoization of Warsaw, certainly this was quite the shock to the classes of Warsaw, because these were their friends and neighbors. And my father's entire family was put into the ghetto and then shipped to Majdanek. And no one survived except his mother and his uncle, who was elsewhere. And he was in Paris, France at the time, and then he went to Vilnius. And so he avoided the ghetto, and he avoided Warsaw and Poland during the war period. He didn't go back to Poland until after the war.
But I think it's fair to point out, isn't it, because the Germans were quite cynically evil, in the sense that in Poland, the penalty for assisting or trying to hide your Jewish neighbour, trying to protect their children, was death, which was a penalty they didn't impose anywhere else in occupied Europe. So, I mean, this is actually also a particularly cruel manifestation.
Sure. Well, I think they also realized that the highest proliferation of Jewish life in Central Europe, in the places they were going to go and invade and try and create dominion over, was in Poland, and they needed, to execute the final solution, they needed to really aggressively wipe Jewry off the Polish map. It was probably a little easier just based on mathematics in other countries in Central Europe, and certainly around the rest of Europe, like France and Scandinavia, where the Jewish life wasn't as deeply proliferated as in Poland and Central Europe.
It's quite odd because there's no evidence really of any significant form of collaboration in Poland with the Nazi regime, the Germans. Whereas in France, of course, in Vichy, the government was actually helping the Germans by identifying its own Jewish citizens and helping to round them up, which is
a lot of countries in Europe. There was the Waffen-SS, and there was a lot of collaboration. There were segments of most European political classes that actually embraced the Nazi ideology. In Poland, that certainly wasn't the case. It's a testimony to the strength of Polish culture. It's also a testimony to Poland's history, where Poland had this oppression and imperialization for so many hundred years because geography matters, and the lack of natural land barriers created a ripe situation from every angle, starting from the Vikings, 1,000 years ago, coming across the Baltic to Austria-Hungary and Tsarist Russia, many moments of imperial overrule. And as a result, Poles, I think, really recognized the need for sovereign independence, and it was really culturally embedded in their zeitgeist. And so that's also why there was such a tolerance and openness to peoples like the Jews coming in for many hundreds of years.
Yes, I'd say absolute tragedy that this sort of openness was.
You also didn't have the divine right of kings. You had, selected, elected kings. So sort of a monarchy by election, which was rather one of the more progressive political systems in the history of the world through the Middle Ages into the Enlightenment.
I'm not quite sure the judgment of history will actually be favourable to, we'll think that elected monarchies, were actually quite a good idea.
But there was a meritocracy to it that's not the same as you look at Western Europe, where it's the divine right through primogeniture and inherited monarchical structures. So it was rather a different system and a much more progressive one.
For the time, it was a very enlightened system. Yeah. And I think it's also because, obviously there's a lot of controversy still about the Second World War and the role of Poles and their approach to Jews. But it's probably just worth mentioning, I think, that in the righteous among nations, there are more Polish citizens than anybody else. And
that also makes sense based on math. There were more Jews, yes. There was more Jews murdered.
But I think that's particularly significant, even if you even if you leave the mathematics aside.
About half of all the righteous among the nations are of
But
Polish descent.
just to go back to the earlier point, I think that's very significant, given the fact that they were risking far more by helping their Jewish neighbours than they might have been in other parts of occupied Europe.
Yeah. And I think Poles also recognized that the final solution wasn't just for Jews, it was also for Poles. So, I mean, there was a shared battle because the Germans wanted to wipe Polishness.
Of course, history is a living subject, and sometimes when you see these sort of modern day sort of skinhead types when they're glorifying Hitler, and you think, well, if only you were...
It's a very small fringe, thankfully.
It is, thankfully, but you just think if only you realised that in actual fact, had he, this man you're glorifying, succeeded, your parents or your grandparents at least would actually not be here,
well,
so
you
wouldn't be here.
Look at Schindler's List, and in the final scene, when all the descendants of those Schindler saved go to Yad Vashem in Israel, very, very powerful to see the propagation of family lines and how it grows over the generations.
And that's a very moving moment in the film. But actually, that's quite an uplifting moment to end this segment. So, Matthew, thank you once more.
My pleasure.